Willow married me for money. I was aware that my silence made her despise me. However, I didn't care whether she liked me or not. It was sufficient as long as she was mine. I mentally cursed her parents, her first love, and herself. However, I was unaware that she had the ability to read minds. She was able to clearly hear every insult I hurled at her in my mind. Chapter 1. I was silent at birth. My parents were constantly concerned about my ability to get married. Luckily, the Wang family was powerful and wealthy, so I never had to worry about finding a wife. My elders arranged for me to wed Willow, the eldest daughter of the Liu family, because I wanted to live my life with a kind and moral wife. However, I subsequently learned that Willow had already had a childhood sweetheart. After her parents divorced, she was compelled to wed me. The first time I realized something was wrong was on our wedding day, when I silently cursed her ex-boyfriend in front of her. I'm not sure when Willow developed the ability to read minds. My face was gloomy as I stood next to Willow on our wedding day. Fortunately, she also didn't feel like smiling. Therefore, we both accepted the guests' congratulations with a blank expression. Well, until Makoto arrived. Willow's expression softened into a faint smile for the first time that day. Disgusting, I thought to myself. If someone didn't know any better, they would assume he was the one getting married today because he is dressed like a groom. I was mentally cursing Makoto. Willow turned abruptly to face me, a hint of caution visible in her eyes. I looked at her curiously, not knowing what was happening. As she said, "Watch your words." Her admonishing gaze passed over me once more, this time with a hint of annoyance. Absurd. I was silent. What had I said? I kept swearing at Makoto in my mind, and I also cursed Willow in the process. Although I appeared to be cool and collected, Willow's face darkened as I asked her in sign language, "What's going on?" She carefully enunciated every word. "George, do you have a problem with us?" What the hell was she doing? She was reading my mind like a parasite living in my head. On the outside, though, I smiled at her without understanding. With a chilly sneer, Willow turned back to Makoto and resumed their conversation. Anyone would assume that this was their wedding rather than ours based on the way they were acting. I maintained my courteous smile, but on the inside I was yelling obscenities at Willow, who sighed in frustration. Chapter 2. Makoto's unwillingness to part with Willow was evident on his face as the reception drew to a close. Willow's parents had also arrived at the doorway to greet the visitors. In addition to remaining silent when they saw the two of them hanging around together, Willow's mother even grinned as she took my arm and escorted me out. "They haven't seen each other in a while," she said to George. I nodded and grinned, saying, "Let them catch up. We'll wait for them in the car." However, I had the mental image of a mother and daughter. It takes a shameless mother to raise a shameless daughter. Willow came to a halt. Her face darkened and I saw it. However, I simply assumed that she was irritated that I was moving too slowly. I never would have imagined that she was able to read minds. I casually threw another curse at her father as I waved at her. Willow couldn't say anything because a rotten daughter must have a rotten father as well. Her mother and I waited in the car for more than 30 minutes. At long last, Willow and her father walked slowly over. "George and I will return to our place," she said, turning to face her mother. Her father shot her a look that halted her mother's questioning. When her mother realized, she gave her a heartfelt smile and said, Okay, you two go home and have a good night." The moment I got out of the car, their car took off. Willow stood there looking as if she had no plans to go home. I gave her a perplexed look. "So it's not just Makoto you have a problem with. You have issues with my parents, too," she inquired, leaving me speechless. I stared at her in even more bewilderment, wondering how she knew about everyone I cursed in my mind. However, Willow kept her ability to read minds from me. She merely warned me icily, saying, "Don't make things hard for Makoto." When we split up, his heart was already broken enough. Oh, how heartbroken he was. He may have stared into space for 2 minutes. Then, in a dramatic declaration, he told Willow. "I will wait for you forever, even if you marry someone else. Wearing a suit to your wedding, does that count as being your groom even for a moment? Makoto even had the gall to attend our wedding today and post on Twitter. That post is currently pinned at the top of his social media accounts. His greatest insult to me was his extravagant show of affection for Willow. That should be enough to excuse me for making his life miserable. But Willow still had the audacity to caution me for his benefit. I sneered inwardly and boldly said, 'If you love each other so much, why don't you have the courage to ask me for a divorce? If it weren't for my mother's mental peace, I wouldn't have married you in the first place, and you have the audacity to treat me like a fool simply because I can't speak. Sure, you can talk, but I haven't heard you say a single good word yet.' George Willow finally gritted her teeth and called my name. Her outburst surprised me because I was so engrossed in my mental tirade. Willow glared at me and demanded, 'Did you just call me a dumbass?' I asked her, looking directly into her eyes. Yes, everything I said was accurate, but being caught red-handed like this was extremely embarrassing. Chapter 3. I signed to Willow, but she didn't want to share her mind-reading skills. 'How do you know I was insulting you?' She simply rolled her eyes and said, 'Your facial expression conveys everything.' In other words, she said, I could curse someone out based solely on my facial expression. I touched my face, finding it hard to believe that my ability to control my expression had suddenly deteriorated to this point. I then signed, 'I didn't call you dumb,' with a genuine smile. Willow briefly closed her eyes, appearing as though she had recently sustained internal injuries from extreme annoyance. I turned away and went toward the car by myself, acting as though I hadn't noticed. However, my mood felt as heavy and limitless as the night, extending without any sign of light. Willow married me for financial gain, as I had always known. She hated that I couldn't speak. Luckily, I also didn't like her. I had put up with her presence for more than a year, but it was all a performance. However, the doctor informed me today that my mother only had 3 months to live. I didn't want her to worry about anything during this last stretch. Even though I detested Willow and had no intention of marrying her in the first place, I could tolerate it for the sake of my mother. However, fate had never been kind to me. I received a terminal illness diagnosis. Not only was I devastated, but so was the doctor who had been caring for my mother. "George, you're so young," he said. "How could this have happened?" I was also devastated. Surprisingly, though, there was a hint of relief beneath the sadness. I could be with my mother once more if I passed away. It didn't seem like a big deal. I remained at the hospital that night. I got a call from an unidentified number late at night. It was a close friend of Willow's. "Willow, her brother-in-law, is intoxicated," she said. Someone next to her muttered urgently, "Are you stupid? Your brother-in-law's mute, he can't talk. How is he supposed to respond to you? Oh, I see. Can you come pick her up?" A tone of embarrassment entered her voice. "My bad," she then added. "Brother-in-law. I hadn't intended to reply, so please text me if you can come." However, perhaps because I was dying, the long-suppressed thoughts suddenly came flooding back. Separation. My goal was to get a divorce from Willow as quickly as possible. However, a 1-month cooling-off period was now required before the divorce could be finalized. Although a month wasn't long, it was too valuable to me. Before I passed away, I wanted to cut off all contact with Willow. I then went to get her. Lying docilely on the sofa, she was totally inebriated. I waited for her to sober up while sitting quietly next to her. I would file for divorce the moment she did. Chapter 4. After lying on the couch for a while, she sat up and frowned, appearing uneasy. I fixed my unwavering gaze on her. Willow froze when our eyes met, so perhaps my stare was too icy. She felt as though the alcohol in her system had somewhat subsided. She asked impatiently, "What are you staring at?" "Let's get a divorce is what I signed to her." Willow didn't get it. She still didn't know much about me, even after we had been living together for more than a year. She was unable to understand any sign language that was even slightly complicated or unusual, since she had never even made an effort to learn. I silently chuckled bitterly to myself. It's tiring to talk to a fool. Willow's eyebrows went up. My phone rang, and I typed a sentence for her to read. She blinked at the words, momentarily dazed, still intoxicated. I pointed at her when she asked, "Who's divorcing who?" Next, at myself. She finally got it. However, she found it hard to believe. "You don't seriously think that after divorcing me you'll have a bunch of women lining up for you, do you?" She sneered at a silent man who dared to ask her for a divorce. I remained resolute. She became even more irate. "All right, I'll agree to a divorce if that's your desire. However, everything we previously discussed remains unchanged. The investment made by your family is non-refundable." I gave a nod. Think of it as the cost I incurred to ensure my mother's happiness during the previous 12 months. Although it was a substantial amount, a deal was a deal. It could not be undone. Willow gave me a suspicious look and even slowed her speech when she asked, "George, why do you suddenly want a divorce?" If she truly cared about me, that should have been her first question. However, she first vented her rage because she didn't. She didn't bother to inquire why until after that. I didn't respond, I simply gave her a smile. She grabbed my wrist and repeated, "Why are you suddenly insisting on a divorce?" as I got to my feet. She stood to lose a lot. Something had to be the cause. She was presumably accustomed to being loved, so the idea of being abandoned by a silent man was intolerable. However, she ought to be pleased if she gave it some thought. She could publicly be with Makoto after our divorce. Wasn't it fortunate that I recalled that I had been ready to make our marriage work when I proposed to Willow? We could be respectful partners leading stable lives together even in the absence of love. People didn't know how my mother and I had almost been destroyed after my father passed away. They only saw our wealth now. What would you do in this situation? Comment below and subscribe for more. My mom had always feared that I would become an orphan. She was concerned that Willow and I wouldn't last after I got married. She therefore went above and beyond to support Willow and the Liu family in the hopes that I would have a happy marriage. But I was already sufficiently embarrassed by our wedding day. At one point, I had asked Willow to speak with Makoto about taking down his pinned post that made fun of our marriage. However, Willow had stated that anyone could post anything they wanted. You have no right to control him, and I have complete freedom over what I do or do not do. Don't try to dominate me. That's when I realized that Willow wasn't even deserving of respect. I never tried again after that. However, Willow saw my very presence as a limitation on her autonomy. Now, however, that restriction was going to be lifted. I thought I was going to die, Willow. At last, you are free. She abruptly relaxed her hold on my wrist as that thought struck. Her face flashed with shock. However, I was unaware that she could hear what I was thinking. Simply put, I was glad she stopped asking questions. That spared me from having to explain. She didn't love me after all. She had no regard for me. Why would she care about my death? Saying too much would only make me appear weak. I turned and headed upstairs to the bedroom. I couldn't help but sigh inwardly with each step. What a waste of a lovely face. She would be ideal if only her character were stronger. They deserve each other. So how could Makoto allow her to bear all the blame for cheating if he doesn't love her that much? At least they won't ruin anyone else after ruining me. However, what a shame. I had never experienced true love while I was on this planet. Perhaps I could have had that experience if I had met someone better. Willow, however, wasn't deserving. Chapter 5. Willow went out to meet a friend after I went to bed. She had known her friend since she was a young girl. She knew something wasn't right the moment she saw Willow's face. Willow appeared worn out at the bar, her brows furrowed in concern. Sophia asked, "Did you and George have a fight?" Willow gave her a sidelong glance. She was annoyed that she was simultaneously correct and incorrect. It wasn't just a fight, divorce was a huge deal. And then there was the sickness of George. It appeared to be grave. Willow scowled as she picked up the cup and sipped it. However, she tasted tea instead of the well-known burn of alcohol. She let out a sigh. She recalled that she and Sophia were sipping tea at that moment. Really, it was strange. Sophia only ever drank tea while working at a bar. Willow inquired, "So, why did you quit drinking so abruptly?" Sophia answered, "It wasn't abrupt. 2 years have passed." Willow scowled. However, it happened abruptly 2 years ago. Sophia remained silent. Willow went on, "If I recall correctly, you stopped drinking because of David, right?" Sophia gave her a look. "Did he really influence you that much?" Willow asked. Willow sneered and took another sip, asking how someone could drink tea and still talk so much. They were silent for a long time. Then, suddenly, Sophia said, "He had a big influence on me. It seemed like my life was over when he vanished." Willow scowled. "However, you didn't seem to give a damn when he was around." Sophia let out a sigh. "You must therefore treasure people while you can. That also applies to you." There was an unwritten age-based hierarchy among their friends. Despite being the oldest, Sophia hardly ever gave lectures, especially when it came to relationships. Perhaps she was finally opening up because it was late and they weren't feeling well. When Sophia asked Willow how she truly felt about George and Makoto, Willow replied, "I don't really feel anything for Makoto anymore," after taking a sip of tea. He was deeply affected by the abrupt breakup. I wanted to make it up to him because I felt bad. Sophia gave a nod. Willow whispered to George, "George." After pondering for a while, she struggled to find the right words. Sophia speculated, "You're just accustomed to him. Perhaps you've grown fond of him over time." Willow paused. A bit, perhaps. She only became aware of how awful habits could be after George abruptly requested a divorce tonight. She imagined returning home to an empty house in that moment, and it annoyed her. Willow rolled her eyes at Sophia's advice. "Since you've moved on from your ex, don't hurt the person beside you." "Why are you suddenly so wise?" Sophia answered, "Because I lost someone." Willow said nothing. Sophia let out a sigh. "Follow my advice and be kind to George, or you'll be sorry." Willow grinned. Sophia laughed icily. "Will you buy me a drink at last if I regret it? I hope that stubbornness lasts a lifetime." Chapter 6. Willow was gone when I woke up the following morning. She didn't respond when I asked her where she had gone. After some time, I heard sounds coming from outside. I believed she had returned. After all, she had essentially agreed when we talked about divorce last night. "We're supposed to visit the Civil Affairs Bureau today." However, Makoto was standing outside when I opened the door. He had always treated me in an unpleasant way, and he was even more unrestrained in his mockery now that Willow was gone. "Let's talk," he said. Then he sneered, "Oh, right," as if he had just remembered. "You can't speak." He had a voice, just like Willow, but he was unsure of how to use it effectively. I was still interested, though. I stepped aside and motioned for him to come in, asking him what he wanted to talk about and what right he had to insist on speaking with me. After raising an eyebrow in surprise, Makoto entered and took a seat on the couch. I turned to get a pen and paper so we could talk in that manner. A visitor shows up and you don't even offer them water. What kind of visitor was he? Fortunately, I didn't love Willow, or he would be my enemy. He sneered before I could write anything. "Say what you need to say," I wrote with a smile. "Avoid wasting my time." Makoto chuckled coldly. I smiled once more and wrote, "It was your Willow who married me in exchange for temporary peace of mind. Do you think that just because you married Willow your life will be easy? You two will eventually get divorced." The Liu family would have long since filed for bankruptcy if it weren't for my family's investment. They wouldn't dare throw me out completely, even now that they've recovered. If I didn't bring up the divorce, Willow would most likely remain with me forever. I looked at Makoto calmly and indifferently, wondering who he thought he was. Threats are unnecessary. There's no need for harsh language. One glance was enough to show the balance of power. Makoto was enraged. He gritted his teeth and leaped from the couch. You believe that having money makes you unbeatable, but no matter how wealthy you are, you remain silent. I asked Willow, and she hasn't even allowed you to touch her in all this time. Even if you don't get a divorce, you won't be able to have children together because your dad is dead. Your mother is dying, and after you leave, everything you own will bang. I struck Makoto in the face, causing him to fall back onto the couch. As he struggled to sit up, he gripped his face. My fingers hurt from the force of my blow to him. However, he had raised my parents. I didn't care if he had Willow. However, he should have been hit if he dared to discuss my family. After a while, Makoto came out of his reverie and began to scream at me. He most likely wanted to defend himself. However, outside we heard footsteps. Willow was back, he realized, so he had to put up with it. I had to be the antagonist. Willow did not let him down. When she saw him bleeding from his nose as soon as she entered, she turned to me and said, "George, what are you doing?" Here we go again. I couldn't remember how many times I'd seen this scene. At times I even had the suspicion that I was merely a prop in their little affair, which added to the excitement. However, I wasn't complying today. I grabbed my phone, opened it, and hit play on a recording. It was a compilation of all the taunts, insults, and mockeries Makoto had directed at me whenever we were by ourselves. His voice was unmistakable and loud, one sentence after another, sneering and spitting out disgusting words. Makoto's face turned white. Willow was taken aback. Makoto lunged at me, attempting to grab my phone before the recording was even complete. Makoto Willow had a sharp, low voice that was tinged with barely controlled rage. Makoto froze, his eyes flashing with panic. Willow's expression stayed dark as he hurriedly attempted to explain, "You have to believe me, that's not me." He must have used artificial intelligence to fake it. "Get out. Willow, get out. Don't make me repeat myself." Makoto's face twisted in exasperation as he clenched his teeth. Ultimately, though, he was forced to stagger out the door. To be honest, his performance would have been flawless if he had been able to hold back a few tears just now. He might even be able to win an Oscar with his acting abilities. Chapter 7. Willow softened her tone after Makoto left after noticing my icy demeanor. "Let's talk, George." Her voice was exactly Makoto's. It was repulsive. I sneered, grabbed the paper and pen, and wrote, "Divorce is the only topic we need to discuss." After a moment of hesitation, Willow said, "I went to the hospital this morning to see your mom." This was her first time visiting my mother by herself in more than a year of marriage, and that was following my divorce request. I wasn't shocked, just disgust. I wrote, "I've already accepted all of your terms." Willow retorted, "She doesn't know you're sick, does she?" "Why did you go see my mom?" I froze. How could she have known I was ill? I jumped out of my chair, my normal poise broken. "You don't have to write," Willow said slowly, after meeting my eyes. "What you're thinking, I can hear." I couldn't speak. Not only was this startling, but it completely upended my conception of reality. It makes sense why she always asked me why I cursed her parents, Makoto, or even herself. She had heard every word of my silent insults. She responded to my question half a year ago, the evening after your hospital stay. My mother's condition deteriorated that night. Although the doctors had proposed a different course of treatment, it was unlikely to be successful. I stayed by my mother's hospital bed until 2 a.m. that night after she went to sleep. The nurse unexpectedly returned to the hospital in the middle of the night after having already left for home. "George, I was concerned about you," she said, holding my hand. Because she cared about me, a stranger, someone who was only working for pay, left the comfort of her bed in the middle of the night. Willow, meanwhile, had attended a party. Makoto was also present. Makoto even made a proud online post about it. They were having a party, and I was in so much pain that I couldn't even let out a cry. The night Willow developed her mind-reading skills was one I never would have predicted. She had just returned home as well at 4 in the morning when I did. I recalled that when she saw me, she muttered something. I was too distraught at the time to listen. I assumed she was whining about how unhappy I was. I now understood, though, that she had been inquiring as to whether something was amiss. I paid her no attention, and that's when she first heard what I was thinking. I wondered that night, why must my mother be ill? Willow should have been the one to suffer. She is deserving. It should be her who passes away. Willow had been unable to speak. She didn't believe it at first. However, she gradually came to the realization that it was real after repeatedly hearing my thoughts. And almost all of the time I was cursing her on the inside while grinning on the outside. She heard 8 insults directed at her out of 10 thoughts. Makoto and her parents are cursed by the other 2. Willow let out a sigh. You always struck me as being petty, that you continued disparaging Makoto in your mind because you were angry about our previous relationship. I had no idea that he had also insulted you. Yes, he made a lot of insults to me. His remarks were also repulsive. However, neither of them had anticipated that I would document everything. Each and every time. Initially, I had no intention of exposing him. The recordings were simply leverage, something I had saved in case I ever needed it. However, I was more than pleased to give Makoto what he deserved because he had requested it. I gave Willow a chilly stare and asked myself, now that you know everything, so what? Willow hesitated and pressed her lips together. She was unwilling to discuss Makoto. All right, she wouldn't be forced by me. I then posed a different query. When will we be visiting the Civil Affairs Bureau? Willow responded that George should prioritize his medical care at this time. I wrote, it's none of your business what I do or don't do. She used to say those exact words to me. I was flinging them back at her now. I got up and walked away without waiting for her response. Willow was unable to speak when she called after me, asking, George, where are you going? Chapter 8, I visited the medical facility. The caregiver smiled as she greeted me. This morning, Miss Liu stopped by. I gave a nod. She asked softly, are you two back together? After realizing I wasn't shocked, I shook my head, then pulled out my phone and typed, we're getting a divorce. She jumped. She gripped my hand and asked, did she ask for it? I said, no, I did. The person who didn't want Willow was me. Despite her stunning beauty, she had never shown love for me or even considered me to be her spouse. The caregiver read the assurance in my eyes and examined my face, wondering why I was maintaining such a marriage. Her eyes reddened as she sighed. Then, what are you going to do going forward? Yes, what would I do? My father passed away a long time ago. My mom was dying. I also had a terminal illness. I couldn't purchase anyone who truly cared for me, even if I had all the money in the world. The caregiver appeared even more depressed than I did. Unshed tears glistened in her eyes. I turned my head away from her, because I might lose control and start crying too if I looked into her eyes. But even if I did, there wouldn't be any sound. Like a boomerang, the silent pain would flow out with my tears before returning and stabbing me in the heart once more. I was too familiar with this sensation. It was painful. I wanted to die and be done with it because it was so overwhelming. Willow had talked to my mother for a long time that morning, according to the caretaker. My mother wiped away her tears in private after Willow left. The caregiver was afraid of making her even more depressed, so she hadn't dared to ask too many questions. However, I could infer Willow's words. What did Willow say to you this morning? I typed out a message to my mother, and she grinned broadly. I signed no to her additional advice that your relationship was improving and that I should put off having children. That's not what she would say. Why didn't my mom roll her eyes in a playful manner? Didn't you constantly tell me how wonderful she was to you? All of that was false. I had even taken photos of my takeout meals and sent them to my mother, claiming Willow had prepared them to add credibility to my stories. My mother believed Willow and I had always been a loving couple because I had told her so many falsehoods. However, I had to be the one to break that delusion now. I wrote, "Mom, Willow and I are divorcing." She wasn't surprised, just a little taken aback. I shook my head and said, "She doesn't love me," before she softly inquired, "Is Willow just throwing a tantrum?" My mom let out a sigh. "I see," she said, reaching out and embracing me. All of the poise she had been maintaining vanished in that moment. Her voice faltered. "Our George is a truly amazing individual. It's her loss if she doesn't love you." Mr. Liu severely reprimanded her. "If George takes this public, he's mute and comes from a single-parent household. The public will support him. Go apologize to George right away, because it will damage your reputation and lower the value of Liu Corp's stock." After scolding Willow, they tried to play the sympathy card by pointing out that you can't get a divorce no matter what. To show my mother how much they appreciated me, they brought pricey presents to the hospital. Mrs. Liu said kindly, "We will discipline Willow for whatever she has done wrong. We'll make sure she improves and George doesn't make snap decisions. The worst thing for a marriage is to discuss divorce so casually." I believed that Willow and I would never be married. Willow entered the room as I was thinking that, and she heard every word I was saying. She knitted her brows. I pretended to be innocent and added the thought big for fun. Foolish? Bozo? After all, I couldn't insult her in front of anyone else. I remained the victim in her parents' eyes. Willow struggled to articulate her feelings. She dragged me outside in frustration. "I'll agree to anything," she said, "aside from divorce." I answered, "So you'd be okay with me having mistresses too, George?" I went on, "Just get a divorce already. Before I die, at least give me some peace." She paused. I didn't anticipate her asking that question, "So do you really despise me that much?" But she had a serious look on her face. "George, can we try again?" She asked me directly. Had her parents driven her crazy? We had never started in the first place, so what was there to try again? I purposefully thought, "Willow, I've never liked you," as I gazed at her. Not even at first. All I had ever desired was a life of stability. Love was unrelated to that. I went on, "Let's wrap this up while we can still be polite. I'll take this to court unless you sign the divorce papers. If things became ugly, it would be more than just my reputation at stake." Willow glared at me while biting her lip. "George, you lack compassion. I'm flattered." The caregiver came running toward me, her face filled with panic, just as she was about to blow up. My heart fell when I turned to face her, George. It shook me with a horrible premonition. She clutched my arm, panting. "Your mom. She's requesting you." It doesn't appear promising. As though thunder had struck inside my head, a deafening silence descended upon my ears. I might have passed out right there if the caregiver hadn't been holding me. I was rushed back to the room by her. My mother's bed was surrounded by medical professionals. Willow's parents appeared nervous as well. "Don't worry, George," Mrs. Liu attempted to reassure me. "We'll locate the top physicians. Your mom will be all right." No, she wouldn't. We were wealthy. Enough to hire the best doctors and purchase the best medications. Not enough, though, to prevent death. The doctor turned to us and shook his head, following a series of tests. I swear I heard my own heart break in that very moment. My mother extended her hand as the medical personnel moved aside. I walked forward mechanically while holding it in my trembling hands. "George," she spoke in a fragile, barely audible whisper. "Mommy needs to leave now." Keep your tears to yourself. I wanted to hear her. For her, I wanted to be strong. However, I couldn't stop crying. She attempted to remove them with her other hand, but she was too weak. Her hand hardly moved before lowering itself again. Don't cry, George. I nodded frantically, opening my mouth to speak. I used to be able to talk. I used to call out Mom and Dad as a kid. If I could just say Mom now, perhaps I wouldn't have to regret it as much. But there was no sound. Nothing came out of my mouth, no matter how wide I opened it. Until Willow whispered, George wants to call you Mom, leaning down. My mom's hazy eyes suddenly became bright. She nodded and grinned at me. Mommy heard it. She then turned to face the others and gave them a silent order to go. Willow and I were the only ones left. I assumed she would ask if we could remain together. Rather, she took Willow's hand and pleaded with her. George Willow's frozen eyes shifted toward me as he asked, Will you, please, get a divorce? I felt as though I was out of breath. Something inside of me had shattered completely, and I clutched my chest. My mother had previously been concerned about leaving me alone in the hopes that I would find a companion. But now, she feared I would be destroyed by my marriage. I'm afraid I'll be stuck in a mistake for the rest of my life. She wanted me released by Willow. She muttered, Please, accept the divorce. In the end, Willow agreed, though I wasn't sure if she was moved by a dying person's final request or if she finally had a conscience. My mom sighed in relief. She grinned and touched my head. George, just be yourself. Be joyful. Yes, I will. Mommy is going to find Daddy now, she said. Come later, all right, and be our child once more in the next life. All right. George. I took her into my arms in her last moments. There, in my arms, she breathed her final breath. I felt her life slipping away as I held her hand. I wanted to apologize, Mom, but I'm going to defy you one last time. I'll be right over to find you and Dad. Chapter 10. I found myself in a hospital room when I awoke. Willow occupied the chair next to the bed. I didn't realize how much time had gone by. She hurriedly said, I've already made arrangements for your mother's funeral, as she saw me get up. Don't hurry, leave. Willow found herself momentarily stunned by the incisive, unapologetic words. George, I made a promise to your mother that I would divorce you, Willow said, attempting to maintain her composure. At the very least, please stop detesting me so much. Unless you pass away. Willow could not speak. She got up and went outside to cool off, after realizing that talking to me was pointless. She came back to find me frantically typing on my phone. There was something about my appearance that made her nervous. She hurried over and grabbed the phone out of my grasp. As she read what I had written, her eyes grew wide. She yelled, George, do you have to do this? I retorted, I already told you. I don't mind making this public if you refuse to divorce me. I was going to publish a statement about my divorce. Even if it damaged the Liu family's reputation, I didn't care. Even if Liu Corp's stock fell, I didn't care. I was going to die. Willow looked at me for a while, asking why I should be concerned about anyone else's survival. When she realized I wasn't going to back down, her expression finally changed. It was subtle, but tired. George, I already promised your mother that I would divorce you, she said softly. Don't bring up my mother. She might have lived a little longer if you hadn't gone to the hospital and told her you didn't love her. Willow stiffened. She paused, then said, I never said that. I visited the hospital to inquire about your health. Since I was already there, I thought I should see how your mother was doing. However, I never made such a statement. Perhaps my mother had been too observant to deduce the truth from Willow's behavior alone. After a moment of hesitation, Willow said, I should have told you first. I apologized, George. Yes, I could have at least prepared if she had told me. We could have told the truth. She couldn't have been persuaded to tell the truth by my mother. I was resentful, but after giving it some more thought, I saw that I was solely responsible. If I had confessed my love for Willow earlier, if I hadn't suppressed my rage on the day of our wedding, there were too many ifs. I was exhausted. The Liu family wanted to give my mother a lavish funeral, but I kept things straightforward as she requested. I returned to my own home after she was buried. Willow was followed by tabloid reporters who took multiple pictures of her outside my building, but never inside. People began to speculate that we were on the verge of divorce because our two families had a falling out. The stock prices of Liu Corp plummeted as a result of the rumors. In the hopes that I would make amends with their daughter, Willow's parents came to see me. "George should consider us as well," Mr. Liu said. "If we're being completely honest, Willow never really did you any harm. How will it help you if our business fails, Mom Willow?" Willow hurried in and interrupted her mother. "Go home," she said, turning to face her parents. Their disapproving expressions made it obvious that they were unhappy. Willow gave me a quick look. I hadn't even moved. More significantly, I hadn't given it any thought. Her expression changed to one of uneasiness. She said, "George, let's go for a walk." I hadn't left the house in more than 2 weeks since moving back. I was alone in this enormous house. I remained silent, and nobody said anything to me. As Chapter 11 progressed, Willow disregarded her parents and led me outside, allowing me to immerse myself in this silent world. She asked, "Is there anywhere you'd like to go?" after we got into the car. I looked out at the sun, which was warm and bright. After feeling lifeless for a long time, the blood in my veins appeared to stir once more. I wanted to visit the mall, I thought. Willow gave a nod. She didn't question my sudden desire to go shopping, but she didn't understand why either. Not until I purchased a suit that fit properly. She began to understand at that point that I wanted to wear it when I visited my parents. The sun had already set when we reached the cemetery. The gravestones were illuminated by the warm, golden glow of the sunset. I smiled and straightened my collar as I stood in front of their tomb. I asked myself, "Do you remember what I'm wearing today, Mom and Dad? It looks exactly like the suit you both chose for me on my birthday when I was a kid. I dressed this way so you would know who I am right away. Living alone wears you out. I really do miss you two." Behind me, Willow listened to everything I had to say. If she heard, it didn't matter to me. Nothing mattered anymore at this point. Willow, however, was concerned. Abruptly, she moved forward and encircled me with her arms. She sounded hoarse, as if she were having trouble suppressing something. A matching donor was found by George at the hospital. "You will be able to live if you have the transplant. I am not obligated to do so. However, you previously stated that you do not wish to engage in any form of interaction with me after your death. I scheduled the surgery for a month from now," she said, tightening her grip on me. "You can have the operation after we go to the Civil Affairs Bureau to finalize the divorce." The deal was alluring. I wouldn't have hesitated to agree if my mother had been alive. Now, however, I had no motivation to continue. My body ached, but it was nothing. But the anguish in my heart was sufficient to overwhelm everything. I thought, "I'm tired, Willow." I shook my head, but she whispered, "Then please, I'm begging you, just take the surgery, okay?" On my sleeve, a tear fell, then another. Behind me, Willow trembled as she spoke in a choked voice. "Your parents would prefer that you survive. Don't do it for me, but for them. We can get a divorce first, please. After that, you can have the operation. George." I let out a slow breath and then thought, all right. Chapter 12. Willow appeared to be in a great mood on the day we received our divorce certificates. She wore a new dress and makeup. She raised her head and said, "Let me take you to the hospital," as she looked down at the small red booklet in her hands. I gave a head shake. She persisted, though. "We decided that you would immediately have surgery following the divorce," she said. "What if you leave the hospital in the middle? I wouldn't argue if I didn't see you there myself." but I had a weird uneasiness all day for some reason. Willow appeared at ease, even happy, but there was something so oppressively heavy about her. She trailed me all the way to the doors of the operating room. She leaned down and said, "George, don't be afraid," just before I entered. "Things will improve." I didn't feel scared at all. She appeared to be the one who was afraid, if anything. Perhaps she had been awakened by that late-night chat with Sophia. Perhaps she had truly grown fond of me over time. However, it was too late. It was all too late. The procedure went well. Lou Corp's attorney visited me with some paperwork to sign prior to my release. After our divorce, Willow voluntarily established a compensation agreement. The amount was equivalent to almost half of what my family had contributed to their business. This was the most Willow had been able to fight for on my behalf, according to the lawyer. That day, she failed to appear, and she didn't confront me again for a very long time after that. She didn't go out in public either. A lot less attention was paid to her parents as well. Even when the media directly inquired about her, they stayed away from the subject. I transformed all of my possessions into a balance in a bank account. After that, I departed. The weather was terrible that day. It rained constantly. I watched as raindrops trickled down the glass window of the airport. Then I thought I saw a familiar figure in the reflection. However, all I saw when I turned around was a sea of strangers. People are moving quickly in search of better futures. No time to turn around. After 2 years. After a long period of silence, Willow finally shared a message on social media on Lunar New Year's Eve. Happy New Year. The photo was of an airport, but aside from the glass panels, there was no one in the picture. No one seemed to know who she was talking to, but everyone seemed to know. The post received a lot of likes, and no one left a comment. Willow had just put her phone down when an unknown number called. The caller ID displayed an international number. She hesitated before answering, and a voice said, "Happy New Year." The voice wasn't just a thought, it was a real voice, a warm, deep voice that sounded like the melody of heaven. Willow didn't answer, and the call was disconnected a moment later, but that day, it became the happiest New Year of Willow's life. Betrayal pierces deeply, yet karma always finds its way. If this story captivated you, remember to like, subscribe, and click the bell icon for more captivating stories. Your support keeps these stories alive.